Thanks for bearing with me, guys. As I said, my name is Sam. Welcome to Situations with Sam. I am on our account solutions team here at Dubbs, and we love educating and we love giving you more ways and new ways to use your Dubbs account. So today I am super excited to be bringing you this webinar all about using CSS with your Dubbs lead capture forms and other forms in Dubbs too. We're going to be focused on the lead capture form in particular though. I've got my outline, so let's get going. First, let me cover a couple of expectations for this webinar, just so we're all on the same page as to what is being covered today. Number one, I cannot teach you everything there is to know about CSS in roughly an hour. It's a really big topic. It's a really fun topic. I love it. I used to be a web designer before I came to work for Dubbs, so I'm glad those two worlds can meet today. But of course, with the limited time that we have, my goal is to get you inspired to maybe learn a little bit more about CSS and use it to help your forms blend into your website better if you're embedding that lead capture on your website. I'm also not going to teach you how to make every single edit possible to a Dubbs form. So there are lots of things you can do. There are, different edits you can make to proposals versus on a lead capture. There's so many fun things you can do, but we are sticking with the basics today. So basics for just controlling the styles of the fonts on your forms, looking at how we can just make some tweaks to how the question boxes are displayed to give those a little bit of style, and also just jazzing up the submit button a little bit, some styles you can add to that. So that's what we're focused on here today. There's lots more you can explore on your own. I also mentioned this briefly before we got started. This is going to be covering the super basics. So if you're already a web developer, if you're already really familiar with HTML and CSS, this webinar might be a little bit slow for you, but I hope you can pick up some tips on using CSS in your Dubbs forms nonetheless. All right, and finally, and this one is really important, guys, Dubbs support does not offer any support on custom code that you're adding to your forms. I know this might be frustrating, but unfortunately, we just can't offer that, personalized support for adding custom code to your forms. I'm excited to bring you this webinar and kind of point you in the right direction, but it's ultimately something you're going to have to manage on your own. So if you're, still not comfortable with using CSS, after today's webinar and after doing some learning on your own, I really encourage you to reach out to your web developer and get some extra help. And I'll give you some additional resources you could look to at the end of the webinar as well. But please note, if you write into our chat, we are unfortunately not able to help you with the code that you're adding to your forms. All right, so that is all out of the way. So let's talk about what is CSS? What is it that we are working with today? And we can't really talk about CSS without talking a little bit about HTML, because they really kind of go hand in hand and they're both important. They are, both really important to understand. So HTML, you may have heard of, it's short for hypertext markup language. And this is basically just the structure of web pages. If you think of a web page like a house, the HTML is sort of like putting up the framing for the house, defining where the rooms are. What it does is it gives structure to your web page and adds in the content. So when you make a web page out of HTML, you're basically saying, here's a heading here, and this is what the heading says. And then underneath that, I'm going to have a paragraph, and this is the text that goes inside of the paragraph. So it's that structure to your web page. And if you look at the handout, and I have it pulled up here, let me see if I can blow it up a little bit, you will find that HTML is made up of different elements. So that's how we build the structure. And in this example, we have a heading 1. So that's going to be our biggest heading on the page, the most important information on the page. And you can see sort of, how HTML is written, right? So the element here, it starts with an opening tag, and we have a closing tag, and everything inside of it is the content for that heading. We see that structure sort of repeated. So you don't need to be able to necessarily write your own HTML working with Dubsado forms. I'll cover that in a moment. But it's good to be familiar just with what it looks like so that you know a heading is contained within these tags, or a paragraph is contained within these P opening and closing tags. So just good to familiarize yourself with it. It's also just good to be familiar with the idea that each element, each HTML element on a page can have different attributes. So there are lots of different attributes that HTML can have, but a few that we might see popping up again and again as we look at CSS are the attributes, classes, and IDs. So it's sort of a behind-the-scenes way to identify different elements on the page more than just it's a paragraph. Well, which paragraph is it? So classes and IDs help you identify those HTML elements. So you'll see that kind of coming together as we take a closer look at CSS. All right, so getting to CSS now. This is short for cascading style sheets. It is, in our house analogy, it's all of the style choices that you make for your web page. So if the web page is a house, the CSS is like the paint that you put on the walls, and what shingles you choose for the roof, and what knobs you choose to put on your cabinet doors. So it's all of those style choices. So if we just write a page and just plain HTML, it's not going to look like much. There's some default styling from the browser that just displays the text, but the CSS is where all of that magic happens in terms of how the HTML gets displayed, its appearance. So how do we do that? How do we write CSS? Well, CSS is essentially made up of rules, and each rule contains a selector where we tell it which part of the HTML we want to look at, as well as a declaration where we say, this is what we want it to look like. So if we look at this example here, we have a rule for our heading to style. So remember, in HTML, that H2 element is for a secondary heading. So for all of our secondary headings on the page, these are the rules for what it should look like. So this is the declaration for our selector. And in this particular case, if we put this CSS into our page, all of the secondary headers would be purple, because we've said the color of the text should be purple. The font size should be 20 pixels large, and the font weight should be bold. So we've defined what we want those headings to look like. And we'll talk a little bit more about what these are in a moment, but hopefully you can already see CSS is not so scary to look at. It's actually very readable. We can, obviously you can use like your hex codes for the colors, but it's really kind of intuitive to read what is going on here. So what is going on here with these colors and font sizes, etc.? These are called properties, and they have values. So each of these sort of pieces of the declaration is a property. So the color of your text is a property, and the value of that in this case is purple. So CSS has, kind of a big library of defined properties that you can work with, but then you get to decide more or less what the value is going to be. So if we're defining the font color, we're always going to start by saying color, but then you get to decide what color it's going to be, either using a keyword like purple in this case to make it easy to read, or what I more recommend is using a hex color code, which you might be familiar with if you've done some branding in the past. It's a 6-digit code that renders a color. So we have our properties and our values to go with those properties. So again, it gets kind of easy to read once you're kind of skimming through it. Now, the way CSS is written is very important. This is called syntax. So there are rules for how you have to write and present the CSS. Can't just write it however we want, like write a sentence. I want the heading to be purple. That's what kind of makes it look like code, right? Is this structure. So when we are writing a rule, the selector always comes first, and then we have our curly brackets. So everything, all the declaration inside of that rule is housed inside of these curly brackets. And every time we have a property, then it is followed by a colon, and we give our value, followed by a semicolon. So each pair of property and value is separated by semicolons. So this makes it possible for the browser to read your instructions on how that CSS should be displayed in the HTML, or how the HTML should be displayed, really using the rules that you set out with the CSS. So it's very important that your syntax is correct. If we just were to remove one semicolon, it could break the entire thing, and your headings would no longer follow the styling rules that you set out. So it's very important that it follows those syntax rules. Likewise, as I mentioned, the properties in CSS are predefined. We can't just make up what the property is going to say. So there is sort of like an existing list. It's a very long list, and you don't need to memorize it. You can look it up. I'm always looking up properties if I am not familiar with them. So they have to be written out as they are defined. So the property for the color of a font is just the word color. It's not font color. That won't that won't work. It's not the correct format of the property. So you have to make sure you're just using the correct term when you're adding those properties in. And again, that's something you can always go back and look up. All right, so that is CSS in a nutshell. There are so many more things you can do and so many more things to learn about CSS, especially when it comes to which rules get applied in situations where things might overlap. Things can get pretty crazy. We're not diving deep into that today, but hopefully this is a good primer on just what you're looking at when you're looking at CSS. So you can kind of see how you can start reading and manipulating it and writing some yourself. So I also want to cover a couple of things about just how all of this fits into Dubsado forms, right? So we covered what basically HTML is and what it does, what CSS is and how that interacts with HTML. But there are kind of some special things to keep in mind when we're working with Dubsado forms in particular. So the number one thing to keep in mind is that, and I'm going to be sticking to lead captures specifically for this webinar, but a main thing to keep in mind is that with your Dubsado lead capture form, when you embed that on a website, let me skip ahead a little bit to the form we're going to be working with. So when we click that share button and we grab this code, you can see it's called an iframe code. So this basically works sort of like you're putting a separate web page into another web page. A little bit of web page inception there. So we have, this code being embedded on your site to display the form, and the Dubsado form is completely self-contained. It is not going to inherit any of the styles on your existing website. So if you have, the font Playfair display used all over your website, it's not automatically going to be applied into your Dubsado form when you embed it, because it's self-contained in sort of its own little box. So any styles we want to put on the Dubsado form have to be applied within the form inside of Dubsado itself. And along with that, and we will go over this more in a moment, but that is accomplished by using a code block element on the form. I'm just going to drag one in really quick here. We'll just pop it in somewhere. So your CSS will be inserted into a code block on the form. And it's also important to keep in mind that not every Dubsado form accepts a code block. Lead captures, of course, do, as do proposals and questionnaires, but for security purposes, you cannot add additional code to contracts or sub-agreements. You're limited to the formatting tools that we give you there. So another thing to keep in mind, we talked about HTML. The HTML of a Dubsado form already exists. That's what you're doing when you're building the form in the form builder. You are putting the elements together in the order and layout that you want. In the background, the HTML is being generated for the form. So you don't need to actually generate it. What you do need to do is hook into that HTML to target it in your CSS. So we just need to know what are the HTML elements on the form so that we can use them as selectors in our CSS. So that's what helps to be familiar with HTML. Now that said, you do have a little bit of control over the HTML itself when it comes to using the text boxes in the form. So that's going to be the text box element. We have one right here. I'm going to be going over how you can help give these a little bit more structure and make them easier to style. And we went over the code block already. So those are just a few things to keep in mind about, just how this all relates to a Dubsado form. You don't have to write all the HTML for your form from scratch, but you are going to be looking at it to know what to target in your CSS. All right, so we're going to get in now to actually going through what it looks like to customize a form, add some CSS to a form. Before I jump in and share the form, more about the form that we're going to be editing, I just want to point out a couple things you might want to have at the ready. Your website, of course, it's going to make the most sense to be adding custom code to a form that you're embedding on your website, but even if you don't have a website, you can definitely still do this to style your forms more efficiently. For this demonstration, we're using a lead capture form, so you do need one of the forms that takes a code block to practice this on. And I really recommend having a plain text editing software. So if you're on Windows, this would be like the built-in Notepad, or on a Mac, this is like your text edit application, just something where you can, write in some plain text. I like a free app called Atom. I have it pulled up here, and that's what I'll be using to demonstrate. If I pull up what I've written already, you can see it's kind of cool. It colors the syntax for you, so it just makes it a little bit easier to read. And if you're just getting going with, learning CSS, it can kind of just, help you, visualize a little bit better what you're writing. The reason I like to write the code, not just in the Dubsado code block, is sometimes it takes a lot of time to write the code, depending on how far you're going with the customizations. And if your internet disconnects while you're doing that, or you forget to save your form, it could be a real bummer if your code were only saved on the Dubsado form, right? So sometimes it's nice to just write it outside, and then we can copy and paste it back in. So I recommend just using either one of the built-in plain text editing softwares, or checking out Atom. No affiliation at all. It's just something I like to use and recommend. Okay, So let's take a look at the form. Thank you so much to everyone who submitted their forms to volunteer for the webinar. Unfortunately, I could only choose one, and I'm very lucky Rachel from Harts Design, skipping ahead a little bit there. Rachel from Harts Design very luckily won the spot here. So I'm going to be working with her form. And what I've done is I, kind of did the old, cooking show trick of going ahead and, customizing a version already so you can see what we're getting to. And, just some very subtle things going on here. We have, some different fonts happening that will match your website a little bit better than, just the standard. And depending on, how well this screen share feed is going through, you may or may not be able to see that the outlines for the question boxes are like a little bit of a medium green color that match her site as well. And finally, at the bottom, we have a send button that I've spruced up a little bit also to match her website better. So this is what we're going for. And this is where we're starting. So this is Rachel's lead capture form right now. As you can see, it's what is showing on her website. Another thing to keep in mind when you're embedding forms on your site is they are mobile responsive, and that doesn't just mean the form will change layout and size based on the size of the device someone is using to access your site. But it also, means that it fills the available space that you give it. So in Rachel's case, she has this kind of 2-column layout here on this page, on her contact page. And the space available for the form to be embedded is, this smaller width. So that's what we're working with here. And as I start to go through our steps that we have in your handout for when you maybe want to try this on your own. The first step is to finalize the layout of your lead capture form. So before we start adding in the CSS, we want to make sure that we are happy with the layout of the form. And I have a few tricks for you just to help your form appear how you want it to appear on your site. So when we look at the layout of the form currently, we can see that we have first name, email, last name. It's all in kind of one column element right now. We also have what service are you interested in. Rachel is using checkboxes for this because she doesn't have workflows set up for all of these options. That is 100% okay. It's wherever you are at and however you want to do it. So instead of using a workflow element, she is checking on what the client has selected from these two categories of checkboxes here. And we have some date select fields and short answer and another free response at the bottom. But if we look at how this is structured with the photography and graphic design options side by side, go back to her website, we can see that the photography and graphic design checkbox elements are getting kind of split up by the date select fields and the short answer. So how can we resolve this? Well, this is because all of these elements are currently contained in a single column element. So we're not defining how we want the rows to be broken up. So a tip I have for you is that when you are putting elements into columns on your form, think about how you would want the rows to be split up if that form got, squished in size this way. So I'm going to add another column element here. Click on that to turn off the title. And I'm going to move the email down into this second column and the last name up here so that this displays in the correct order. For the service they're interested in, I'm going to add, again, another column element at the bottom here. And we're going to be moving the date selects and the location down into that new element, just so that, oops, that should be okay. Just so that they do not get left behind, or excuse me, they don't get sandwiched between those two check boxes there. So with that change, now, if I go ahead and save this, and let's refresh her website, any changes you make to the lead capture are updated live on the site. We can now see that those checkboxes are showing in the correct order, so they're not getting broken up any longer. And that's just by moving the columns around a little bit. Awesome. All right, so we have our layout set. The next step you want to take is to look at your text boxes on the form. And the reason this is important is because if we want to style the text on the form with CSS, we want to make sure that, number one, the text has the right structure. So our headings are, placed as we want them to be. And we also want to make sure that nothing is going to override the code that we work so hard to put in. So what do I mean by that? If we first go into the settings tab of the form, scroll down a little bit under questions styling. If you have set a default font, a size, color here, any of these settings, if you have one of these set, it's going to override any CSS that you add to the form. So first, make sure that you clear these out. You also want to make sure on the form itself that within any text box, you clear out this formatting as well. So I'm going to highlight all of this. And right now the font is set to Poppins, 30, size 30 for the hello here. If I try to change the font face, which font is being used for this text, it's going to get overridden by what has been selected here. So when I click on the formatting options drop down, and then all the way at the end, I'm just going to select clear all formatting. That's going to give us a clean slate. It will, just bring it back to, this basic format. I can now go back in and add the structure that I'm going to target with CSS later on. So if we look again at our kind of goal with the form here, we can see that the hello, this is our heading 1, and it's in that, pretty red color. And this is Playfair Display, the font. And then our body text is in Roboto Condensed, and it's a different color. So all I want to do right now is just set up that the hello is going to be our heading. So back in the form, I will highlight the hello under formatting options, then the paragraph formatting dropdown, and choose heading 1. So I'm telling it this text is going to be a heading 1 element. And then when I write eventually the CSS, and we'll get to this here, if you can see it on the left-hand side, we're targeting our heading 1 and we're giving it the styles it needs. So this is how we build structure into the text. I'm going to do the same thing with this kind of heading here. I've decided to make this a heading 2. So again, I'm selecting that, clearing the formatting first, so we just revert to the default size and font family, and then under paragraph format, I'll select heading 2 for this. Now, you'll notice this was looking a little large. It's pretty large title. It's, kind of matching the size of the hello right now. That's okay, because we're going to control that with the CSS. The heading is just what the structure is meant to be. There's a default style that goes with it, but you get to choose ultimately what it will look like. So, take the structure over the style right now, because you can apply that later. All right, so I think we're pretty well set up with our form structure here. And the next step is really to make a plan for how you want to set up the form. So for this piece, what I tend to do is look at the site where the form is going to be embedded and just identify, some places where things are not really lining up. So for instance, right now the form has that Poppins font. I haven't saved the changes yet. And it's not really matching anything else on Ray's site. And, the colors aren't quite fitting in. I definitely want to kind of tie this in a little bit better. So what I did was I looked at the About page. Really cute. I love this bold heading text. So I definitely want to replicate this for our heading. And then this is what most of the body text looks like on the site as well. So I know I want to make the body text on the form match this too, so that everything is cohesive. The last thing I identified was on the home page. I was looking for, what we might want to style the button to be. On the home page, I noticed, the contact button is in this really pretty yellow color. That's different from the brand color that she's set. She may choose to just go back to the brand color afterwards, but at least for the purposes of our webinar, I'd love to show you how to override that brand color for the submit button on the form. So we'll be going with this yellow here. Once you kind of identify the changes you want to make, we have to maybe get some values on that, right? So we're still talking properties and values. What are we actually going to write into the CSS to make text look like this? And really neat trick, I'm going to expand this back out here, is that you can highlight or right-click on just about any element on a web page and right-click on that element and choose Inspect. So I'm using the Chrome browser right now. This is also available to do in Firefox and Safari. It might just be called something a little bit different. But whatever browser you're using, look up how to use the inspector tool. It's usually called the inspector or web inspector. And it might be in your developer's tools somewhere, but you may just have to look up how to enable it. But I'm just right-clicking on that heading and then choosing Inspect from that menu, and it brings up this, sidebar with all of this information. What it's showing me actually is the HTML up here at the top, the CSS that's in action down here on the left-hand side. And that's also just giving me some more information about the spacing around this element, what the margins and border and padding are for what I've selected. So you'll notice as I scroll through here, it's highlighting different elements on the web page. So I can see, for example, this div, it essentially means a section of text on a page. It's an HTML element. This has a margin of 60 pixels on either side. And we can see, the outline of that. I'm looking though at the H2, our heading 2 in this case. So in this instance, we have that H2, and now down here, I can kind of start skimming through the CSS to understand what properties and values are being applied currently. So I can see that the font family is Playfair Display. The font weight is 700. The font size is 44 pixels. We have a line height to work with as well. But this is starting to give you an idea of, okay, well, what are the actual styles being applied here? We can do the same, highlighting some text below and inspecting that. So we can see now that this paragraph is selected in the inspector. And we might have to scroll through a few things. You kind of just, by just testing this out on your own website, you kind of just learn where things are coming from. So we can see that in this case, the font family is probably Roboto condensed. I'm not seeing a whole lot of other information right now, but I think I decided on a font size. Okay, here we go. So these are styles being inherited from the body element, or the main kind of element for the entire web page. The color is the hex code 666. So it's that dark gray, so we can find that. Font weight 500. So you're kind of pulling these styles out. So this is something kind of during your planning phase, just checking out your website. You can do this on any website and kind of look up what code is going into it, so you can make a plan. All right, so there we go. That's our plan made. And we've done our formatting, made our plan, took a look at the elements on the website, and now it's time to actually start writing our CSS. So here we go. On the side here, I'm going to start with a blank file so we can do this together from scratch. So again, I am going to put a code block on. I like to just click and add it to the very bottom of the form so it's out of the way. I can click on that to add the code in here, but I'm going to write it in my text editor so that I can save it and come back to it later more easily. So we'll come back to that code block in a moment. When we write the CSS to insert into the Dubsado code block, we have to wrap it in some HTML style tags. So just like any other element, like a heading or a paragraph, we have tags for a CSS style that we're inserting into the page here. So I'm going to start with our little lesser than bracket style, and then a closing bracket. And I'll come down a line and close it out style. So these are the tags that open and close, and all in between is where we're going to put our CSS. So everything is wrapped in those tags there. All right, so the first thing we want to take a look at is customizing the text. I kind of mentioned before that this is actually a really efficient way to style the text on your form, even if you're using fonts that are built into Dubsado. So if I want to edit the text, or if I want to format the text here, I have to click in, I have to highlight what I want to do, I pick a font, pick a size, and I have to do that just about every single time I want to edit a similar text box, or I have to keep duplicating the text box. This is actually a very efficient way, because from this basic format, the code just does it all for you. So let's start with just the basic fonts for the whole page. And if you remember, I mentioned that there are things called classes and IDs when it comes to HTML. Not going super deep into that, but just know that in a Dubsado form, there is sort of a wrapper or container around the whole form with the class JB-form. And this allows us to sort of select the entire form and set our font style for that. So when I want to put a class into our CSS and target an element with that particular class, I'll put in a period and then JB form. So that's our selector in this case. We're selecting the element with the class JB form. I'm really oversimplifying this, but again, go along with what is written here. So then we have our curly braces, our curly brackets, and inside of those will be our declarations. So I just make an enter, and it's good to indent a couple spaces when you start writing your properties and values, just to make things readable. So for our main body text for the entire page, let me grab our values here, and then I'll talk a little bit more about them. So I took the liberty of writing those out ahead of time. So we want to make the font Roboto condensed, and the font size should be 20 pixels. We might adjust that a little bit later. Font weight is 500, and the color, I did an RGB to begin with. This is just another way to write out a color. We can change it to that number that we found when we were inspecting in the browser. Okay, awesome. So let me just copy this and paste it into our code block so we can apply it to the form. And right away, as soon as I add that code in, we can already see that font family, Roboto condensed, and the size and the color being applied to all the text in the form, not just the text boxes, but in our questions. So it's a really quick way, just with a few written out instructions, to just really customize the form to your brand. Pretty cool. All right, so now we can, actually before I move on, I know some of you have some custom fonts that you use. There may be fonts that are not in the list in Dubsado, so I wanna make sure you know how to bring those in. I'm gonna use a Google font as an example. So under Google Fonts, I have that pulled up here, fonts.google.com. You can also use the same method to bring in a font that is hosted on your website. Just because it's here and it's very obvious that it's something different. Let's bring in this Chilanka font, and just to show how we can bring in this external font. This is not one that is in the list in Dubsado. So the reason I was able to just write in Roboto condensed is because if we look in Dubsado from our drop down here, these are the built-in fonts. Roboto condensed is one of them. So it's already preloaded. We can just tell it that this is the font that we want. And you may have noticed too, it's in quotation marks. That's because it's a 2-word font. So that just makes sure the web browser knows that this is the whole name of the font. It's not getting confused. So back in Google Fonts, let's say we want to pull in one of these. I'll click plus on the font I want to use. And then in our pop-up down here at the bottom, this is where you can grab the code. So we're going to embed it. And to embed the font, we want the @import option. This lets us put this into this type of CSS. So right here, I'm just going to grab this code. You can actually see they have the style tags as well. We don't need to add them again because they're already in our document. I'll just grab the code there. And this makes it so that now our form can call up this font. So let me paste it in and copy this and put it back into our form. And nothing's happened. The reason is we haven't changed what font family we want it to pull in. So this is still saying we want the font to be Roboto condensed. But if we change this to, we can take out the quotation marks there, Chilanka, we can now see that the entire form has, turned this, very playful handwritten font because we've called it in from Google Fonts with that @import rule, and then we changed the font family. So that's how you're going to bring in a custom font from outside of Dubsado. The URL here, if your font file is just hosted on your website, you would use the URL of the file stored on your website. So let me just take that out so we can move on here with our original font. There we go. And next step is to handle the rest of the heading fonts. So back in what I've already written, I'm just going to pull in the heading 1 and heading 2 styles that I chose. And I'm going to paste those in and we can go over them. So let me actually pull these in here. Okay, so we now see that because we set that hello to be a heading 1, it's taking on the styles right here. So to target a heading 1 on a Dubsado form in one of these text boxes, you're going to just specify the class JB form before the heading. So that way, it's only targeting the headings within the form and it's not kind of bleeding outside of that. I am going to post hopefully I'm working on a help article that gives you, some direction as to what these selectors are, so that they're kind of written out for you and you just need to kind of fill in what you want the rules to be. So you can kind of just go along with what the selector is. So in this case, it's that .jb form H1. And we've told the font family, we've said it's going to be Playfair Display. That's what we saw maybe in here, that Playfair Display is one of the options, so I don't have to import it as a font. It's already there. We've got the font size, weight, even the line height and the color, again, all coming from the website. So again, all of these styles are just coming in from whatever your brand is, and we're writing them out in the proper way for CSS. Same thing with our H2, but the H2 is going to be the same exact font as we already set out for the form. So a key to writing good CSS is trying not to repeat yourself. So it is code that has to be loaded, and the more kind of code we add, the slower things can load. So we want to try not repeating ourselves when it's possible. And because the font Roboto Condensed has already been applied to the entire form, all I need to change for the H2 in this case is the size. In fact, well, I'm going to leave the size different because I might change the body size. But if we wanted the H2 and kind of like the default size to both be 20 pixels, I really shouldn't have it in here because it's something that's already been defined and we're repeating it again. So that's just adding kind of unnecessary bulk to this. But I'm going to leave it back in there just in case I decide I want to, lower the body size a little bit once we get it on the site. All right, so that's our fonts kind of settled. To keep moving along here, let's go on to the questions. So these questions are looking awfully large. They look a little bit too large. Maybe the first name and email are the same size as this paragraph. So I want to change the font size of that. And to target the question text, so any of the text that is appearing before a question on the form, that selector is .jb form label. So we're going to pull that in as well. Let me just start building it in here so that we can move along a little more quickly. So as soon as I pop that in, you can see that our question text has gotten a little bit smaller. So it's just, a way to kind of start finessing that. The next thing I want to look at is the actual boxes. So let's see here. I'm going to grab this portion and let's look at this together. Just for the sake of time, I wanted to have everything written ahead of time so we don't have to write it out from scratch. But this next portion, we're looking at, again, the short answer boxes, in this case, the check boxes, date select fields, the button with the calendar icon, the free response field. I'm going to make these blend in a little bit better. You may be able to tell that in the default style of these boxes, there is sort of like an interior shadow. That's great, but maybe I want to take that shadow out. So the way that we do that is with the property box shadow. So the box shadow property in CSS controls what that shadow looks like, and there's different values you can type in to kind of really style the shadow. You can look that up. But in this case, I just want to change it to none. None is an acceptable value for a lot of properties. And that will take the shadow away so that we can get to that little more cleaner, modern look that you're seeing here on the finished example. You'll also notice that the form fields, they have kind of a rounded edge on the corners. That's cool. Maybe you want to accentuate that and give it more of a rounded edge. I want to take this down though to more of a square corner. So I'm going to use a border radius of 0. Again, it's just a property in CSS. You can, kind of look up the different properties available and choose values how you, depending on how you want it to appear. And I want to encourage you to, sort of play around with this a little bit too. So hopefully you can see in the background now, those edges have really squared out to a 0 pixel corner. They're not rounded anymore. But right here for the border radius, you can experiment, just see what changing the value ends up doing. So if I change this to like 20 pixels, now we've gotten a totally rounded look with almost like a pillbox shape. So we have these, totally rounded edges on all of the buttons and fields. Not quite the look we're going for in this case, so we'll take it back. But you can see how just changing the values really helps you grasp what the CSS is doing. Take that back to 0. Finally, you'll notice I have here a property for the border. So I wanted to change the border color to make it that green. So on Rachel's site, there's a lot of green. I just thought it was a nice way to kind of tie in a little bit more. So I took some inspiration from the background here. With certain properties, the value that you write in is actually going to be a few different values all at once. So with a border in particular, you write first the size, so the width of the border. In this case, I want it to be 1 pixel. Again, we can play around with that. 10 pixels. Wow, that's a really thick border. We just want 1. So you can play with that value. Solid is the appearance of the border. So it's a 1 pixel solid border. We could write instead, I think, dashed. There we go. So dashed as a value makes kind of like these dashed outlines. So you can look up different values for borders. Kind of fun to play with. We'll change that back to solid. Followed by the color. So these are just patterns that you kind of learn to use over time. You can always look up a property and what the values for that property should be. And then you can just fill it in with what the value should be. So in this case, again, I have an RGB color code instead of a hex. Normally I like to use hexes, but I went with RGB this time. So we have our border defined here, and it's giving it that nice green border. Now you may have noticed that the selector looks a little crazy. There's a lot happening here. So in the, previously we were looking at just selecting a single element at a time and just applying styles to that element. Well, we don't have to just select one at a time. We can actually select more than one element at a time if we separate them by commas and spaces. So for these, for this role right here, I'm selecting JB form input. Input is covering all of the short answer fields, as well as the box for the date select field. We're also selecting the JB form text area. So that is going to be for any free response boxes. That is a text area. The JB form select, this is referring to a drop-down box. We actually don't have any drop-down boxes in here. That would be if I put on a drop-down box or a workflow element or a project tracker element. Either of these elements or the drop-down box would be styled this way. So you can see that drop-down box has the green border. We're also selecting, this is kind of a tricky one, I'm not going to go deep into, but the label with the 2 colons and then before, this is actually referring to the check boxes. Kind of a tricky one to select, but I wanted those check boxes to turn green as well. And then just the class.btn-cal, that is selecting the calendar button, and we don't need the JB form class before that. It's just the button cal. We're selecting that there so we can get that green border on the calendar button. So we got to select all these elements at one time and then style them all at once. You can really see how this becomes an efficient way to define styles on your form and really make it match your brand. All right, we are almost done here, getting to the end. Thanks for sticking with me. The last thing I want to cover is making some changes to the button. So the submit button on a Dubbsado form kind of lives in a world of its own. He's a little bit stubborn. So let's pull over some code to look at for that. Here we go. So let's pull this into, we're going to actually start saving this now. The tricky thing about styling the submit button on a Dubbsado form is that you can't see the button until you're looking at the form. So once I save this, I'm going to go ahead and kind of basically push these changes live to the website here. Let me make sure. Oh, see, this is where things get a little tricky. Do as I say, not as I do. I missed a piece here for our label because I had just put that in the form and not in here, so it didn't get copied back over. There we go. And I guess if you just wanted to write it in here, that's fine. Maybe consider saving it elsewhere just so that you can return to it later and maybe add it to your other forms very easily. All right, there we go. So I'm going to go ahead and save. And when I save, these changes are now going to go live to Rachel's site. So let's refresh. Take a look at that. Okay, great. I love how this is starting to, really kind of tie in a little bit better to what she currently has. So we've got our submit button down here. The submit button, like I said, is tricky because we can't see it until it's, we're looking at the live form. But what changes have we made? We changed the background color. So this is a big one. The background color of the button normally inherits from your main brand color that you set in your brand settings. And to override that, we actually have to add a little bit to our value, this important property. So it's an exclamation point followed immediately by the word important, no space in between. This is generally not a great thing to use in your CSS unless it's absolutely necessary. In this case, it is absolutely necessary, so it's okay to use. We do have to add that important. If we don't, if I take that off, you go back to the form here. If I were to take out this important piece, and this color again is a RGB code for that gold color that's on her site. If I save that, we just took the important out and reload her site. At the bottom, oh, we are still seeing, oh, there we go. The form didn't actually save. There we go. Now it's saved. Let's refresh again. There we go. So now we're seeing that the color is back to her brand color. So we can put in any color we want for the background color on the button, but if we don't add the important property there, it's not actually going to take effect. So you definitely want to have exclamation point important written in. Let's take a look at some of the other properties and values we have. So let me quickly save this and refresh the page. So we're back looking at the styled button. There we go. So let's see, the border radius coming back again. I added a little bit more border radius to match the radius on these buttons here. So it's more rounded, the corners. The higher the the more pixels you put in for the border radius, the more rounded it's going to be. You'll also notice that I put in a border of 0 pixels. The reason for this is that by default, Dubsado puts a border around the submit button in the same color as the brand color. So we would have kind of this weird red border, because that's her brand color, around the button. So by just setting the border to 0 pixels, we just remove the border and we don't need to kind of do anything else with that to make it match. You can, of course, add a border, change the border of the button and make that, match your site a little bit better. Maybe the style on your site is to have, thick borders on the buttons. I've definitely seen that. We have to define the font family again. So I know I said before that normally, once you kind of define something, if it gets inherited by other elements on the page, we don't want to write that out again. It's repetitive. It's not good code. But in this case, for this selector, we're actually using an ID here. So hashtag submit button with a capital B. This is case sensitive, followed by just the element button. So we're looking at the button element inside of we'll call it a container it's really a div, but inside of a container with the ID submit button. This is kind of outside of the rest of the form. So even though I told, make the, JB form area have the font Roboto condensed, it's not getting applied to the button area. They're 2 separate spots. So that is why we are defining the font family, size, weight again. You can also change the color of the font on the button. Maybe your brand color is lighter, or you just want to have a darker, some kind of different color of the font where it says send. You can do that. You just have to add that important tag again. So you'll see right here in my code, I have it lined up and ready to go. You may also notice I have a / and then an asterisk on either side, repeating. This is how we make a comment in CSS. You can actually write in notes to yourself. So I could put in a / asterisk, and then this is the submit button. And then followed by, again, an asterisk and a /. And it's essentially telling the browser, ignore me, I'm just some text. So you can kind of make a note to yourself if you think you'll forget what you styled in the form. But we can also use it to remove certain pieces of code if you want to kind of test things out. So if I go back into the form here in our code block, and down at the bottom, we have that commented out property and value pair. All I have to do is just remove the / and the asterisk, and now that code is active again. So now the color of the font on the button would be changed to, this is like a dark gray color. So if I close that and save and refresh the page again, down at the bottom, you can see that darker color. Just something to note, the send button, submit button does kind of, it just grays out a little bit, so it's not quite as bright until you fill in all of the required fields. So if I make sure there's something in every required field. Now you can see at the bottom, it's showing the full color. Okay, so back to our form. What else is there left to color? I think we've pretty much covered everything. The last piece is adding some padding to the button. So padding is just sort of internal space. It's what made the button a little bit bigger around the edges. So if I go back into the form here, the bottom, if I comment out our padding, and I'm going to remove the font color there because we don't need it. If I comment out the padding just to deactivate that piece of code and save, bring this up again. Just taking an extra moment to load. There we go. Down at the bottom, you can see the button is like a little bit more squished together. If you want to just create some more space around the text, that's where this padding comes in. So when you're filling in the value for your padding, you can, kind of control where that's being applied. So what this is doing right now is it's saying add 6 pixels of padding to both the top and the bottom of the element, and then add 30 pixels to the both sides of the element. So that's where we get that extra space. This allows you to kind of just write all of the padding in one line. If you want to change the padding individually for the top, let me go around here. It goes clockwise basically, which may look backwards to you, but if you think of it going around clockwise, it goes top, right, bottom, and then left. You could write out different values. So I could say 10 pixels for the top, 6 pixels for the right, 15 pixels for the bottom, and 30 pixels is the last value, so that would go to the left. So again, these are just things you can always look up the property of padding for CSS, and then lots of great resources online will tell you how the value should be written out in different situations. In this case, we're just changing the top and the sides the same way. So we put in the 6 and the 30. So the 6 pixels top and bottom, 30 pixels left and right, and that just follows the rules of writing CSS, so the browser knows how to translate it. All right, that is pretty much it. I'm actually really happy with how this is looking. I checked in with Rachel earlier this week and she was a fan too. Just a couple extra little tweaks. So after you do this, there might be just a few more things you want to tweak a little bit. One main thing I want to tweak, and that a lot of folks I know struggle with, is this extra space at the top. So Dubsado forms are built in to have extra space at the top and a little bit, not so much at the bottom, but mostly at the top of the form. So how do we get rid of that? That we actually have a help article for that has some code in it to get you started. I will make sure to pull it up really quick so you know where to find it. If you go to our help center, help.dubsado.com, and just search margins, we have an article on removing padding and margins from your lead capture form. And it's this code right here that you can add in to your CSS. Just at the top is fine. So I'm actually going to copy it right from our help article, as you would, and pop that in the top. There we go. So I'll save that. Oh, let me make sure I made those last changes. We do want to see the padding. And back here, there, that's looking much better. Much less space there at the top. So you can kind of work that into your into your design. The one last thing I'm seeing is it looks like this text was split into 2 separate lines. It's not quite wrapping around in a pleasing way. So I might try maybe splitting this up a little bit more. We could decrease the font size. I know Rachel mentioned to me she definitely wanted to see some larger font sizes for better visibility on mobile. So this is certainly helping with that. But I think a big thing would be also the space between the text here and where the question starts. It's looking a little squished. So let's see what we can do about that. Oops, let's get back into Rachel's form. Okay, so in here, and this is important to note too, sometimes when you make changes inside of the form editor, a few things will be a little bit different once you're viewing the form live. For instance, right now we can see that there kind of is reasonable space between the text and the questions. And that's not happening on the website right now. So some things do change a little bit between the form builder view and the final view. So in the form builder view here, one kind of quick and dirty way to handle this is to go into your text box and just make a return. So just, typing enter or return on your keyboard and then typing in a space character. And that just adds an extra line. So that's great in a pinch if you just need to do that. But with the power of CSS, we can add a little bit more, a little bit more elegantly, some vertical space between our text. So down here, I'm going to add in a margin for the bottom of our form text. And actually, I did some research earlier, and we don't need the JB form before the form text. But if we target the element with the class dot form dash text, and we give it a margin bottom, so in this case, instead of giving an all-around margin, we're just saying only apply margin, it's extra space outside to the bottom. It's going to target all of the text boxes on the page and just give a little extra space. So you can kind of see right now, it added that extra space there. If I save it and go back to her site, we have some extra space happening there, and she's added in some dividers which we can leave in, but that's looking a little bit better. And she can always go back in. Rachel can go in and maybe change some of the font value, the font size values if she wants to make it larger or smaller. That's always possible. You can kind of just keep tweaking things until you're happy with it. It doesn't need to be perfect the first time around, but I think we got a really great result here, matching her site much better than what we started with. So that is pretty much it. Thank you for going on the journey with me of customizing Rachel's form. And thank you so much to Rachel for offering up her form for the webinar. I'm so very appreciative of that.